Warning, this episode may contain content that is not suitable for children. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hey everybody, welcome to LED Live. Today's topic is a hot topic, and I don't believe it's talked about enough in our church. So it's going to come with a warning. If you have small children, you might want to watch this first before you share with them. But we're going to talk about sexuality. A lot of young kids are exposed way too early. How does it affect your identity?
Find out on this episode of LED Live.
As we get into this topic here, I'm very excited to introduce our guests on today's show. We have two special guests, Kezia and Michael Carducci. Michael's been on our show before, so you might have seen him, but thank you guys for coming on. And, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart. I have small children, and, this is a topic that my wife and I actually talk about a lot. When is it time to bring these topics up to our kids? And, definitely early sexual exposure can really set you on a course for your whole life. Yeah. And I'm sure as we get into your testimony about this, we're going to see exactly what kind of damage that can do, but also God is a redeeming God and how he can flip that around for his glory. So welcome to the show. Thank you. Tell us a little bit about this topic.
Yeah, so sexuality, it's definitely something that everyone deals with, as we know. I know for myself, it was one thing that I didn't think was a big issue. I just thought everyone dealt with their whole sexualities at any time in the age. So it wasn't really until I had gone to Cuba on a trip and I came across Mike, where I was then realizing that what I was going through with the bisexuality, pornography addiction, that it was actually a big issue of mine. So that's what we're going to really get into today.
Michael's with Coming Out Ministries, and you were dealing with this sexuality thing, and you went to one of his ministries?
No, we were on it was a mission trip. Everyone was able to come in. We were in Cuba at that time, and so there were about 18 people on this trip. And Coming Out Ministries, two of the colleagues were also there. I was there with just as a general missionary, just being there as well. And so I knew what I was going through, but I didn't think it really made that much of a difference, even though I knew I was serving God, primarily because it wasn't something that was really spoken about in church. Right. And so for me to be on that trip, to see how God was really working things out, one morning, because we would come together and have morning devotions. And then I remember at one point, Mike had shared for him that pornography was his best friend, that anytime he was feeling like lonely, tired, or angry, that he would turn to it. So being that we were having devotion outside, the sun was shining, I had my sunglasses on, and I started to tear up because I was like, wait, this is actually an issue of mine. And so that's where I really saw that I have to get help. But there were a lot of things that had happened on that trip for me to really see that I had an issue.
You were such a master of disguise, because you would have those dark glasses on and she would sit there stoically, and you were such a dynamo on that trip, because it was probably one of the most spiritual trips I've ever been on. Yeah. We were so united, and the translators that were with us and the people were just in such great need financially and spiritually. And we would have these 2-hour worships in the morning. And Kezia was like one of the main speakers, and she was talking about the sanctuary. And so I didn't have a clue. And those glasses, they hit a multitude of what was going on inside her head. I had no idea you were even affected by that.
Yeah, it was a lot.
So wait, you were preaching on the sanctuary?
Yeah, it was
in a different church every night.
Yeah, it's a different church, because it was a group of us that we were all assigned different topics to touch on. So sometimes it's like, who are we in Christ? Christ and marriage. Another thing was like sanctuary. So it just so happened to be that I had to speak on the sanctuary. So when I was speaking on that, it really touched me, because I'm coming from a construction background. And so I knew that anytime builders or architects, they wanted a building built, there was a lot of detail behind it. It took years to build. So to see how God was really specific with the details, with the materials, the dimensions he wanted, it really showed me how much more he wanted to restore his image within me.
And how important that message really truly is. Yeah. I mean, there's this was God's plan to solve the sin problem. You know what I mean? So it's like the blueprint, if you would, for humanity and our need of bringing our sins to him, laying them on the altar, realizing that we need another substitute for those. I mean, those are deep, deep concepts.
Yeah.
So you're preaching this message, which is literally how God can like solve sin in your life.
Yeah.
And yet behind the scenes, you're totally engaging in other things.
Struggling. Yeah, definitely. It was pornography, masturbation. There was a bisexuality aspect of things, the sexual addiction that was going on. So I knew at some point there were other things I was also doing when it came to drinking, smoking, smoking weed. There was a lot of depression I had going on, the suicidal thoughts, primarily from teenage years. There was a lot going on when my parents divorced, me trying to figure out, who am I coming from a biracial home. So there was a lot of things. God was not the center of the household. So even though a time came when I finally accepted Christ, some of those things went away. But when it came to the sexuality aspect, that had to be the hardest thing to let go of. I didn't think it was possible. So even for me to be able to be here now and to speak on that, it's a miracle of its own.
You know why I absolutely love this topic is because look at what God has done, right? He gives us this beautiful thing called sexuality that's meant to just interlink us together so that it's not broken.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Bond you together, and the devil's just twisted that. And that's why the addiction side of pornography is incredibly difficult to get rid of, because God created that bond.
Yeah.
We're just bonding with something that is not holy, or that is basically outside of what God wants.
I think that because that has been so twisted in church culture that kids are told, oh no, sex is filthy, it's dirty, it's disgusting, when really God was the inventor of full-blown intimacy, and his desire is for us to be able to experience. It was given to us as a gift. And how sad now, because I think that especially when I hear Kezia's story, is that the church has done a huge mistake in not talking about God's intention of intimacy and his intention of sexuality and how that's to be expressed. Because when I met Kezia and realized what she was going through, I was shocked that there's so little education in our church when the world is being educated through YouTube and videos about current sexuality.
So why do you think that is? Have you thought about that?
I think it's because the church refuses to talk about it, or it's just such an uncomfortable thing to talk about. But now, if there can be anything positive about the whole sexual explosion that's in the world today, is the fact that now we don't have the luxury to be silent on this anymore. We have to talk about it.
I was just about to say that. I was going to say it's a sensitive topic that you don't want to have to bring up too early, but you're going to have to beat the punch with the media.
I think that is the main problem. Is I think for all good intents purposes, the church is saying we don't want to overexpose somebody to something. But the reality of it is, what is it, first grade, second grade, that people get exposed to sexual things? I mean, I'm sure we're going to start back from the beginning and get into how you got here. But it's earlier than everybody thinks. And by the time they go, oh wow, we need to have conversations with this when they're teenagers and they can handle the content. It's like they've already had 5 years of their heads filled with nonsense about it, and you're playing catch up. So that's why we want to educate the parents, educate the church members, inspire them. You guys got to get up to speed with this and help our church members out. Because they could be around preaching. Preachers deal with this. And all of a sudden...
62% of Christian pastors are addicted to porn. Scotty, the most shocking statistic that I have is, according to Covenant Eyes, that 3% of boys and 17% of girls have never seen pornography. That in itself just blew me out of the water.
See, I always heard 99% of males deal with pornography and the other 1% lie. So it's like...
I heard the same thing.
I think it's accountability more than anything. I think it's hush-hush because it's such a intimate thing that if it's talked about more and more people kind of reveal what they're going through, we're going to have to take responsibility, and there's going to have to be a form of accountability. And I think a lot of people may not want to talk about it because they want to stay within that sin. If it's not being talked about, I can keep doing what I'm doing because it's not being addressed.
Okay, so I want to hear all the way back. Start back. Let's get into this.
So my mom is Filipino, and so my dad's Guyanese. So automatically from a young age, I just knew I was totally different. Mom, light skin, straight hair. My father, black, kinky hair. And so already I knew that there was something different from me, especially with mom, just being the woman, the girl, I'm supposed to be like her, look like her. So that was a little different. So automatically having that difference just in the facade. And especially growing up in Brooklyn, New York, interracial marriages weren't necessarily that big at that time. And so majority of the schools I would go to, public schools, were predominantly Black Caribbean schools. And so when it came to that Asian side of me, I wasn't really big on it. I wasn't really promoting it because I was kind of embarrassed by it. A lot of times I would just pray, like, Lord, just make me yellow. So there was already this just feeling ashamed just of who I was, and just thinking that, okay, I'm going to be yellow one day, but that never occurred clearly. So by the time public school came about, I ended up having my first sexual encounter with another girl. So I just thought that, everyone did this. This wasn't really taught at home, that if something like this happened, say something if someone touches you. And so I thought this was okay.
So was this person older than you?
Good question.
Same age?
I don't even remember. I just remember her being a little bit bigger than me. We were in our uniforms, and so I know she wasn't like a fifth grader or anything, but I just know she was just a few years older than me.
Where did it happen?
Just school, public school, in the bathroom. I remember at school, public school, just had to use the bathroom. She was there. And it just happened.
And you brought up a great point that wasn't discussed in the home. You weren't there was no instruction given. If such thing happens, this is how you should respond. We're putting a lot of, not responsibility, like, what is it called? Blame. You're putting a lot of blame on the church. And of course the church has a part to play, but it's the home, the nucleus.
It needs to happen in the home. Right. But I also think that if it's not getting done in the home, the church definitely should be prepared to help, guide that discussion if the parents aren't willing or able to have that discussion. But I agree, it should happen in the home first.
And you said public school. Do you mind saying like which grade? Like how young you were?
I think like first grade.
First grade. So look how
it was young. It was a young time. Yeah.
I got a kid in first grade. I mean, luckily he's pretty clueless, I think.
But here's the thing: like you don't have to be so detailed in giving warning to a child, right? If someone touches you in these parts, let me know.
These are
and you don't have to get all detailed.
Right. We've had conversations with that, and we do check in with our kids all the time and ask them, like, has anybody ever said something that makes you uncomfortable or nervous? And I think that they would tell us. I believe so.
And it's important to have that environment, to have that open communication with
kids.
But
what's crazy is people think like, oh, well, if you send your kids over to someone's house, this could happen at a house. This happened at a school.
It happens anywhere. Yeah.
Right.
It's very unfortunate what could happen, because from when that had occurred, I didn't think anything of it. I didn't tell my mom or dad. I just thought, okay, it's another form of play, I guess, in a sense. Didn't think anything of it. Your body starts to feel a little something. And so I didn't know that starting really began a path that I could no longer stop, of course, until years later. But it was one of those things, when that started, it just really opened up something that I was unable to control. Because later on, years down the line, by the age of about 9, this was in like daycare, we were supposed to have our nap time. And so they had grouped us like with the girls, because, you don't think anything of it, just the girls with the girls, boys with boys. The older girls are with the with each other. And so at that point, we were supposed to be taking a nap, but we ended up just fondling each other, just touching each other. So this was another experience of mine where it's now it's in a kind of a group setting, just a bunch of girls, group setting. And so I'm just thinking, when I think of sex now, I'm just thinking with girls, group setting, this is okay.
Wow.
So it sort of sets the stage for even what you're excited about.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like kind of like that. That's why I think like hearing about how the mind works, and we imprint those sexual experiences on our mind, and then we try to recreate them.
Yeah.
So when something like that happens to you, then you're trying to recreate that same kind of experience down the road.
Yeah, and that's the thing. It's like one of the things I was learning was that if sex does not occur the same way I had it at first, it's not as
exciting.
Yeah, it's not as exciting as the first time. So of course now, years later, I'm trying to repeat that over time and realizing that this is contrary to what God desires. And that had to be the hardest thing to break off, because for the longest, I'm just thinking, even when I get married, I desire to have a female in there as well. And it wasn't through counseling, through prayer, and realizing that, this is not God's design. If it was, he would have written it in Genesis, because it took me a few years to really recognize that this is not God's desire for us.
And you kind of separate that world, even though you obviously were Christian at some point in time, it's like you kind of have that life over here, and then you have when the doors close, it's like all bets off, right?
Just to understand correctly, this thing that happened in the bathroom, the girl probably just kind of maybe took advantage of it. But like in the nap time, it was multiple kids, right?
Yeah.
So all these kids had to have some kind of exposure or something. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah,
That's
for
kind of
sure.
shocking.
It is, because that was something that, like I said, I didn't think this was anything wrong. It's just another setting up. Okay, nap
Yeah,
time.
especially when there's more people doing it, it seems more acceptable.
Yeah, and I didn't say anything at that time either. I just said, okay, it happened. So first time I never said anything. Second time occurred, never said anything. And then in the midst of that, I don't remember when, but I know pornography and masturbation came into the picture. So this is before I'm 10. It's just having that already starting at such a young age.
Now, you're quite young, so probably the internet was easily accessible, right?
AOL, dial up.
I even remember that.
Right.
Waiting on pictures to load one layer at a time.
So I want to ask this question because I want parents to be able to see where some of these dark corners of your house can be. How did you get a hold of the pornography?
I mean, one of the things is I don't remember specifically how it started, but I do know, I recall, because my parents divorced when I was about 11, 12. And so this was way before my parents divorced, because I remember my dad was still there. We had the computer in their bedroom. And so I would just go and watch it when I knew they weren't home. And, sometimes I was really active on like the chat rooms, just trying to get anything, just trying to figure out anything, talking to people secretly. So it was just accessible, but I don't remember the very first time. But I know before my parents divorced, I was really active in it, just sneaking around, trying to get to it.
Yeah.
Isn't it incredible? Or like across the board internal moral compass. Like you didn't grow up in a Christian home or anything like that, but you felt the need to hide this and do it in secret. Like it's interesting.
If you're doing things that you can't do out in the open. Now I'm not suggesting that married couples should do those married things out in the open. But yeah, if there's some level of I need to be secret and I can't tell anybody about this, that's where sin can really thrive.
Yeah,
for
sure. It really wasn't until when my parents divorced that's when things really went south.
And that was at 12, right?
Yeah, I was 12.
So that's before the real teen years.
So when my dad left, that was really devastating. I just remember him, packing his bags, and then I'm like downstairs where we were living, and just like having to just say goodbye to him. But it was one of those things where it was just like, why do you have to go? And so that was the hardest thing for me, to now have to live this new life with my mom, who I was still having, I loved her, but at the same time realizing that there was still that hatred, because it was like, I didn't look like you. There's this difference. Because I remember specifically like middle school, I had to go to, it was the first day of school, and we would have the students come together in the schoolyard. And I remember mom and dad were walking me to school. And in the middle school I was going to, it's predominantly a Caribbean school. And so there were like few Asians there. And I remember just telling my mom, you can let go of my hand because you're yellow and I'm black. So it was one of those things where—
You said that?
Yeah, it was like one of those things where I wasn't fully happy with who I was, because I felt like I had to pick one side. And so there was this level of like, eeny, meeny, miny, mo, I have to be one side. I can't be Filipino and Guyanese because of the environment I was in.
Do you mind sharing her response to that, since you actually verbalized it?
I remember at that time, it was kind of like a shocker, but I remember specifically when I got home from school, because they, dropping me off to the schoolyard, my mom, she was like crying the whole day. And I didn't realize the effect of it. You're just young, you're just thinking, pick one side, because I didn't think it was possible to just be, to be both. It's totally fine. That's how God created me. But because of where I was in school, majority of my, classmates, they're Caribbean, Black, or Dominican, Chinese. Like we have like really a small amount of Asian students. So for me, I'm just thinking, Kezia, you have to be one. That's it, just one. You can't be both. So that having that foundation of just struggling, God is not really in my life. That's really what allowed other things to now come about. When dad was leaving, it's like, okay, I can't be Black anymore. Like, what do? I'm with this Asian woman. Right. I'm filled with a lot of just hatred. I'm filled with a lot of frustration. There's anger coming about, because now it's like dad is leaving. My dad was a big advocate in education. So with him now leaving, it came to a point when school for me was really nothing. I became very careless in school. And so having to now deal with dad leaving, mom, she's trying to figure out, how does she now live this new life as a single mother, which was really understanding. At that time, I wasn't understanding of that. It was just like, I don't like you. Now I'm understanding of what she had to go through. But to see, she's trying to figure out her new life, trying to figure out, why did my husband leave me? The man who has now left her, she's left with the daughter who looks like that man. So there's a lot of things she's trying to work through. She's pouring out her anger on me, which was understandable. Now I understand that. But at that time, you know, I'm filled with my own pain. So I'm going to anything, just trying to fill the void, the pain. I'm just having some sort of an outlet. So that's when pornography, masturbation really became more heightened, becoming more promiscuous now with both guys and girls. The depression was really big. My level of anger, where I just wanted both of my parents dead, because I was just like, I don't care. You both are, you know, doing your own thing. You're going through the divorce. What am I supposed to do now as an only child? And so there was the suicidal thoughts coming about. It's like, I want both of them dead, but I also want myself to die as well. And so there was like the partying going on, the drinking, the smoking, the weed, just anything to really.
How old were you?
This was like teenage years. This was just
15?
Predominantly my teenage years. That's what I know my teenage years to be. So just to recognize that I was just doing anything to just really numb the feelings I was going through.
Why I asked you that question is because that would have been the perfect time for your mother to have a conversation with you as you expressed yourself in that way. I think sometimes parents may miss obvious clues. Like the kid I feel like will tell you when they're ready or when they're open. Or especially, I mean, kids have no filter at all. They just blurt out stuff, and it's really the parent's response that will really make or break that child.
How fortunate, because if a parent can put their own feelings aside long enough to realize that the kid is giving you a clue, it's not a personal attack, but your mother could have used that as an opportunity to express the differences. And what I really find fascinating about your story, Kezia, is that you were an only child. So if you had brothers and sisters, then you would have been able to look at them and know who you were as well. But you really didn't have that. The only people you had to compare yourself to was your black father that you look like, or your Asian mother that you didn't look like.
Did your relationship with your father continue after he left?
It was really sporadic. So he's began his new life, and so I'm just here like, what am I supposed to do now? You know, mom's doing her own thing. But with my dad, it was very sporadic. We'll catch up here and there. It wasn't consistent though.
Which also probably feeds into that, like, well, that's what men are like.
Precisely.
Then I'm gonna go for the women. You know, it's like. So you started getting into partying. You started getting. I mean, were you engaging in like lots of promiscuous activities?
Oh yeah, for sure. It was a lot of sneaking out. Sometimes I remember before school would start like around, I think like 8 a.m. But sometimes, like I remember when my mom would leave, she would go to work early, and then I would go sneak out to some guy's house or girls, whomever, before school would start. So it was just trying to feed that addiction
like
anywhere.
In the morning.
Yeah, like you didn't really think of anything at that time, but now I think about it, I'm like, oh, I would never do that. But back then,
you never said that with me. That's pretty. That's pretty much a sign of a sexual addict.
Yeah, and like now I look back at it, I'm like, Kezia, you were a hot mess. Like, what were you doing?
It's not just promiscuity; it's addiction.
You're just feeding it.
It's trying to fill a God-sized hole in your heart. You know.
It was a lot, because like now that I look back into it, just to see what would go on in a span of a week, the amount of partners I would have in between trying to, you know, be consistent in school. I remember I was like in orchestra. So after homework, you know, after school, I'd have orchestra. So, you know, you have this facade of acting like, you know, everything's okay, but really deep down, just being so broken and questioning, like, you know, when am I going to die? Because I just want the pain to end. Right. So that's where it was just having to recognize that I didn't know what I was doing. I didn't have any guidance. And even in the midst of all that I was doing, I remember specifically, especially when I was very active, sexually active, I would always ask God, Lord, just make sure I don't get pregnant or have any STDs. Because I knew for me, if I were to get pregnant, my plan was to have an abortion. I was like, no doubt about it, abortion, I don't care. That was it.
We did a show on abortion, and this is really an interesting topic. But I really honestly believe that, like, okay, you're in high school, so you're what, 14?
Yeah, 14 between 17.
So 14, 15, 16, 17, right? And look at the decision that was made immediately. This is what would happen if I was pregnant. That decision was already made.
Yeah.
And so when that pregnancy pops up, that decision's already made. And what was the age limit that they put on that movie? It was like 17.
Yes, you have to be 18 and older, so 17 and younger.
18 and older. The decision's already made. Right there.
Yeah.
And that's why, man, it's like, we got to talk about this.
Talking about Unplanned. Have you seen that movie?
No.
By Pure Flix?
No, not yet. That's on my to-do list.
Can you put that on?
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's crazy.
If you haven't seen Unplanned, you need to go and watch that movie. And if you have young kids, honestly, 13, 14, they're talking about sexual issues. Show them that thing so that they can actually make a conscious decision before the problem arises.
For sure.
Yeah.
Can I also interject here that as a history of sexual addiction, for me, every time that I would connect sexually with somebody was an affirmation of some little type of value. Is it the same for you?
Sure,
it's like, oh, my mother just left, my dad's not around, and so I need somebody to validate me. So if you find me sexually desirable, even if you just use me and it only lasts 10, 15 minutes or whatever, I got the validation that I need. Now I can go to gym class, or I can go to English.
For sure, because it was one of those things where I recognized at that time it was being able to receive some sort of love, even if it was bad. If I'm receiving something, even if it's bad, even if it's a counterfeit, I didn't care as long as it was filling that need at that time.
How did you hold it all together? Because when I met you in Cuba, you looked like you were complete package. You were like this devoted Christian, and that you were like a preacher or whatever. And then to come from such a conflicted past, like how were you sorting it all together, and even just moving through the day and thinking that was like the truest expression of your Christian life? That's really difficult for me to understand.
Yeah.
For me, it was either one or the other, and you just blurred both of them.
I mean, it just goes to show the level of the addiction, the struggle that I know for sure I was going through. Because when it came to letting go of smoking weed, letting go of the drinking, the partying, that was a little bit easier to let go of. When I first accepted Christ, that was easy. But when it came to the sexual addiction, even like after, from the time I had said yes to Christ and then time from Cuba, I think that was about 6-7 years, a span, the sexual addiction, the pornography, the masturbation, that didn't quite end. Like I tried, and I was under the impression that, you would speak your testimony. In Revelation, it talks about, you overcome by the blood of the Lamb and the word of your testimony. Right. So I was under the impression if I said my testimony that I've overcome it, I've done the work, I'm good. But failing to realize there was an amount of work I had to do in maintaining that victory. So even when you had met me in Cuba, it was one of those things where I'm trying to balance God. I'm still trying to hold on to my addictions. But it was a struggle. It was a fight, of course, because it's two different spirits I'm trying to work with.
So are you going to church when you're in high school?
I would just go when I had time, because the majority of if I would go to church, it would just be for friends. And I would go on Saturdays, after a writing class. So my Saturdays tended to be for school activities. And then afterwards, I would go to church sometimes just to meet up with friends.
And so you're kind of 1 foot, sort of kind of getting into it. Was there an actual conversion point where you actually really started going seriously to church?
It was at one point when, so it was one evening, a Saturday night. I had gone to church during the day. And this is just sometimes I would go to church sometimes for friends, or just maybe there was a program going on, but it wasn't really anything intimate that I was personally desiring. So it wasn't until this one Saturday evening, I was really stressed out about something going on. And so I figured, you know what, I'll just smoke and get high and just numb the pains, the things I was going through. And so I reached out to a friend, and we had smoked, but then things didn't go as planned, where I ended up getting so high, we were both so high that we ended up having sex with each other. So it was one of those things where I was frustrated because that wasn't the plan. The plan was just to smoke, just get high, leave it alone. But because I knew I had to go to work the following day, I tried to go to sleep, but I wasn't really able to go to sleep. And so I had gone to work, and because I was a lifeguard at that time, no one was coming into the pool. So I figured, you know what, perfect, I'll take a little nap because no one would see me.
Wow. Sleeping on a lifeguard job is
no one was coming into the
probably a
pool.
quick tip to stop working as a lifeguard.
So I was just like, I'm just going to take a nap, catch up from my sleep. So I went to sleep, and I had a dream where I saw myself getting rebaptized, because when I was 12, I got baptized just because there were some people just coming in from the church. They said, are you interested? Jesus Christ. So I just did it just because I was like, okay, whatever, no big deal. But God, like I had mentioned, was really nothing to me. I just viewed him as a genie, that he could just answer, my request and I'll be good to go. But it wasn't really until that time where I had that dream and seeing myself getting rebaptized, where I was just kind of in shock of what I knew I did last night. And now God's here, don't worry about that. I'm here to help you, even though you feel like you're at your lowest point.
Wow.
Because that was really a low point for me, because I was really frustrated that, beside the fact, of smoking the weed, it was also now I'm being intimate with this person that I had zero plans in doing that with. And so I was really frustrated with myself. So to see how God was able to work in that moment, in that dream, that's when things really started, where I said, all right, this is the last time I'm going to smoke the weed. When it came to the sex part, I didn't know.
Yeah. You were like, we'll deal with that later.
Yeah.
We're gonna just
Baby steps. So like,
one thing at a time.
baby steps for sure.
I like that even in your darkness, that Jesus was still there for you.
Yeah.
And to know that even though you felt guilt and you were convicted by, your behaviors or whatever, which I find really interesting because before you go to school, it was nothing to have a sexual situation. But now for some reason, there's an element of conviction that you didn't want to have sex. But even after you fell into that, you still hear the comforting words of Jesus, like, that's not why, what this is all about, and that he was still in the middle of all of that. That talks about the intimacy of Jesus Christ.
For sure, definitely.
So this is a turning point.
Yes, for
From
sure.
here forward, you start making steps towards
Christ. Yep. I know when I was in college at that time, one of my close friends, I remember during my freshman year in college, freshman year for me was just really like doing whatever. I was free bird, doing whatever I felt like doing. And so it was between my freshman year and sophomore year, that summer, that's where I had that moment with God, that dream where I was just like, all right, Kezia, we have to stop. God is clearly near with me, even in the midst of this situation that had gone on. And so by the following school year, sophomore year, that's when things really changed, where I started to go to church frequently, like weekly, and also having a friend who I had from freshman year. And I noticed that, when Saturdays, or rather like Friday night Saturdays would come about, she wouldn't do her homework on Friday nights. Saturdays, she'd watch a sermon. So it was one of those things where I would notice, like, what is she doing? Like, why is she so serious with God? And so she was one of those people that really helped me to kind of like start my journey with God and learning to be consistent and building that relationship.
It's so neat too that God takes you where you come to him, and it's like not this immediate, like, you got to do this and this and this and this and this. God just says, let's just work on the relationship. Let's just work on the relationship.
For sure.
You know what I mean? And you start to get this desire that's brewing inside of you. And I mean, this was the same thing for me as well. I mean, it just like all of a sudden I just looked around at my life and I just went, what am I doing? I'm addicted to this, and I'm into this, and I'm all over the board, all over with this. And it was like, God, I think, very patiently wooed me back. And that's what made me ultimately stick around, was just how loving he approached us.
Yeah. For sure. He's definitely patient, super patient.
So you start coming to church. How do you get involved in the preaching?
I'd say it was one of those things where even now, like, I'm still surprised I'm in this as well with God. But it was one of those things that, people would ask you to speak on a certain topic. And so I know initially I was a bit more active with the singles ministry. So I would help out with we would sometimes host programs for the parents where we'd say, hey, bring your kids in. So we'd do like arts and craft with the children. So it would be a various amount of things that I would start doing. But when it came to speaking, that was one thing where I don't even know, is whereas like people would just ask me, hey, can you do this? Can you do a Bible study for us? Even when I went to Cuba, that was a miracle in and of itself, because for me to get to that point, I had gone through a really bad breakup where I remember thinking to myself, you know what, it's better to just kill myself. But I had come across a sermon by Doug Batchelor, and he was just mentioning, if you feel suicidal, think about living your life one more year. So I figured, okay, I could live my life one more year. And if it doesn't get better in this next year, I could always end it. And so that was my thought process, that, Kezia, since this relationship has now ended, let this end now be a new beginning. And so I was really intentional in saying, all right, Lord, I need your help now. Now I'm learning to be somewhat dependent upon God. Before it was, all these other things I was doing. But now as I was, building this relationship with God, I said, Lord, help me to kind of be progressive in these next few years. And so that's where I then started to see, desires of, going on mission trips. One of those mission trips was Cuba. I had gone to Cuba twice. The second time, that's where I had met Mike. What was interesting was like the trip prior to that second trip to Cuba, the first trip to Cuba, I remember just hearing different stories of people, of the locals in Cuba. And I remember leaving that trip just saying, Lord, what's your story for me? And to see how he worked things out the following year, where he was like, I need to work on your own story. That's where I was just like, wow. Because I knew there was a lot of things I had to unpack, but I didn't know it was that deep, that there were still things from my childhood that I didn't work on yet.
Isn't that cool that sometimes God gives you a vantage point? You know what I mean? Like where it's like you're in it, you're around it, you're listening to other preachers. You think you're there working, but I think when we get to heaven, we're going to realize maybe those trips were thrown together so that God could reach you.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
For sure.
And he puts you in that position, and it's like all the angels are working around there to reach you.
Yeah.
And you think you're there trying to minister to somebody else. Right. You're getting ministered to.
And that's really how mission trips work.
It really is.
It's 100%.
And you right place, right time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Precisely.
So let me ask this question, and feel free, you don't have to answer it if you don't want to. Did anything bad happen on any of these trips, or anything were you still tempted?
I was still tempted for sure. I mean, it was tricky because specifically with Cuba, there was no Wi-Fi. For someone who's addicted to pornography, it's one of those things where it's just like, well, what am I going to do now? But the mind, even though I did not have the pornography, I know every person is different. Some people, they need pornography. Sometimes some people are able to masturbate without it because of the amount of things that they have already done. So for me, I was that person.
That's called the harem in your mind.
Okay.
I remember even when I first got into that, like I was collecting people and I would put them in my memory and then, because pornography wasn't available back in the 70s. So I could pull these people out and have my fantasy with them and I would create all of these scenarios. I create my own pornography in my mind. So I've heard it described as a harem in your mind. And so you can always go back to that and recreate that even if you don't have technology available.
For sure.
That's why God says, I want to recreate your mind. I want to give you new thoughts, new ways of looking at things. It's like to have the mind of Christ, right?
Philippians 2 verse 5.
That's right. That's right. The mind of Christ. I mean, literally just every thought brought into captivity of him. And that, I think, is where God wants to bring all of us in our Christian walk.
Yeah.
So then speak to this. Here's the problem. We see the testimony of a child that is growing up with all of these secrets, often looking at pornography in the home when the parents aren't there. As a parent, what can you do? Like, what's the step a parent should make? What do you wish your mom would have done? Or, how could you have felt comfortable to be like, Mom, I'm really struggling here. Like, give me some advice on that.
I know for the biggest thing was just having that level of intimacy, connection with my parents. I was lacking that love that I needed, that connection. Because of course, they don't have to be addicted on pornography. The person goes to some sort of a vice because of a broken relationship. They're trying to fill that void with something, even if it's bad, even if it's just an immediate gratification, because they're not getting that love, that affection from home. So because I wasn't getting that for all those years, that's why I was so hooked on the porn, even with like years later, mid-20s, realizing like, wait, I have an addiction. I was realizing that I still didn't let go of the pain. So I know like over this weekend, a friend of ours was saying that, in order for you to heal, you have to be real. So there was a level of realization, the traumas, the pains that I was still holding on to for about, 13, 14 years. I had never let go of the divorce because of the anger that I was still holding on to. So I had to recognize that, the parents' roles are very important. Yeah. The affection that they show, the love, the affirmation, the consistency, just their presence, just being there, listening to a child after they get home from school. My mom had to work longer hours because of the divorce, right? So it was just one of those things where, I come home, no one's home. What am I learning from? I turn on TV, sometimes someone would come over. So it was one of those things where, because I understood, she had to make that money. I understand she had to take care of me as a single parent. But at the same time, there's, that's why I see the value of why God desired, or rather designed it that it's a two-parent household. Both parents need to be there. What they are able to express and to show to their children is of value. Even if a parent thinks like, this 5 minutes means nothing. Like, no, it means the world that, my parent is there for me, because it shouldn't be, school and church does play a big role, but the parents' role, they are a child's first example of Christ. And so over time, I had to realize that the things I thought of God, that's not who God is just because of what my parent has done. That God is ever forgiving, that he does forget my sins, that he does love me. But it was one of those things that I had to take my parents, the image that I had of God, I had to take that off of what I got from my parents. So that took a while, but definitely a parent's role is really big. Just the affirmations, the love, just being there.
They say a parent truly spends, I think, 15 minutes or less of quality time with a child in a day.
There was an amazing woman. She came up to us and we were doing a Q&A with the pastors' wives. And she looked at us, our panel, and she goes, "Oh, I understand everything that you've been through." And I looked at this woman and I thought, "Lady, you haven't got a clue." But then she started to tell us that she just wanted to see a man naked as a little kid. And she went up to her mother, and any, good Christian mother would just be horrified and, "Oh, that's terrible. And you shouldn't have those thoughts. And, don't think about that." But instead her mother said, "Well, I don't really have a naked man to show you. I could ask your father." And the little kid's like, no, I don't want to see, father naked. But what she did is she answered a question openly and honestly. She didn't shame her for being curious. What she did is she gave her a clinical, example of that, enough to satisfy her curiosity, and that was it. Then later, as she was developing, she found a poster of a naked man in a house that they were cleaning out for a friend, and she wadded it up and she hid it from her brothers and sisters. But she ran to her mother and she goes, "Look, mother, a naked man." Like, that never even computed to me. It's like, I would never have taken that to my parents, as shared with them.
You put it in your pocket. And
Yeah, in the backyard. So what was so amazing is that when she showed her mother, again, her mother didn't freak out. Like a lot of parents, I think, just naturally do, thinking, "What have my child done?" But instead she goes, "Well, you've always wanted to see a naked man. There he is." And then she acknowledged the physical aspect. She goes, "Didn't I say they have more muscles? Didn't I say they have more hair?" And she goes, "Yes, mother." But what was so amazing, and it brought me to tears, she said, "But look at his face. What's he doing?" He said, "Well, he's smiling, mother." And she said, "Well, what do you think he's thinking about?" "I don't know, mother." She said, "Do you think he's a Christian? Do you think he's married? Do you think he holds the car door open for his wife? Do you think he has children?" And what she did is she took it from the physical, she affirmed all that, but then she took it to the spiritual. And what was so amazing, I was sitting there in tears because I thought, I wish I had a parent that I could have gone to with anything. And I think the most important comment or answer to your question is, like, parents, let your children come to you with anything and everything, and don't lie to them, don't mislead them, but tell them the truth. Whatever that truth is, as much as is necessary to answer their question for them, but also to be always open and honest. Because if you don't have that conversation with your kids, and now we don't even have the luxury of waiting until they're in puberty. If you're not having that conversation with your kids before they even go to school or preschool, when little kids are being touched and things like that, you have missed the opportunity. And now you are not the safe source, that the world is a safe source or their friends are the safe source, when it really should be coming from the parents. And how sad, Kezia, that your parents were so consumed with their own recovery of their own divorce, that here this child that was their only child and had no other resources, no brothers or sisters, here's this desperate little kid that is looking for the internet to find some type of comfort. That breaks my heart.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting because when we met in Cuba, and then I had realized that, okay, I have an addiction now, I have to work through this. I didn't know that God would permit it, that now I had a lot of unpacking to do. I just thought, okay, I have an addiction, I'll stop watching porn, okay, no problem. But as I was getting serious with God, as I was really becoming more intentional about my devotion time with him, he was really unpacking things where I realized that, the traumas, the divorce, I hadn't worked through yet. And even in the midst of that, I was realizing that I hadn't forgiven my parents, that there was still reconciliation that had to take place. And so when I finally took time to, apologize to both my parents, or rather have the opportunity to now talk to them and really say, why did you guys leave? But ask my dad, why did you leave? Why did you think it was okay? Talking to my mom about it. I remember my mom, she was then saying, when the divorce happened, the person who really got the most pain out of it was you. So it was one of those things where I was like, I knew I wasn't crazy all these years, that the level of anger that I was holding on to subconsciously, it made sense why I was doing all these things. And I mean, thankfully, I've been taking the time out to really heal from it, to recover, to be intentional and saying, I'm not going to have someone on the side. I'm going to be serious about this. I'm going to have filters on my phones, on my computers, so that I'm not going to the pornography. But in the midst of that, really learning, who is God? because that's really been the crux of it all. It's just recognizing that despite all these bad things that God has permitted to happen, that he still is good. That in Romans 8:28, he talks about, all things work together for good. So it was one of those things that it took me years to recognize, like, how is God still good? Why should I still worship him when he's permitted me to go through this divorce? He saw what has happened. He saw the amount of pain I went through. Why should I still bow my knees towards him? But it took years for me to recognize that God knows what he's doing, that he was not surprised by what he allowed to happen.
And isn't it neat that you should be able to come to God with everything, just like you should come to your earthly parents. You should be able to have that kind of connection. And God can handle it. I mean, he can handle anything.
For sure.
But I thought those thoughts in my head were way too dirty to share with a holy, righteous God. I that was really difficult for me to learn that when I really started to get angry and start, blurting out all this stuff that was in my head or whatever, that was when God said, great, Mike, now we're starting to get real. Now we can really start working with that. What I think is really amazing is that as you were reaching out to God and addressing all of that anger, you talk in your story about this one moment. It's like, Kezia, you're a beautiful woman, and yet you thought you were ugly.
Yeah.
And how God revealed to you that to him you are beautiful. But what evades me so much is that how you didn't know that. Like every time that you were either giving yourself away sexually, you were losing maybe your own self-worth or your self-value.
Yeah, for sure.
But how is it that this poor little girl grows up thinking that she's ugly?
We are always our worst critic.
Yeah. I mean, of course.
Must be a girl thing.
I think what happened was just knowing that with all the things that were going on at home, to hear certain things being said, like, something in regards to like your skin color or your hair texture. So of course now I'm just thinking, okay, I'm ugly. But it wasn't until, so I went through the moment where I went to Cuba, then I went to this conference, and then by the following year, I was really desiring to have a full detox. I went to a health retreat because I have eczema, and I was just like, I'd really love a full physical detox, a nice cleanse. But I didn't know that retreat would really serve as a holistic time of healing, where it wasn't just a physical cleanse, it was also the mental cleansing, the spiritual cleansing. Because in the midst of that, on the first 5 days, it was just like a straight juice fast, just lots of smoothies, juices, very clean. And so, of course, when you're not eating, your mind is really clear to now hear from God. And so in the midst of that, that's where I started to just break down by like day 2 or 3. And I was just like, Lord, it's just bringing things to my mind from childhood. I didn't work through things. And so I remember the person who was my, my counselor, she was just mentioning, to stop running from counseling and to really just get help and to stop doing it like stagnant, just be consistent. And I just broke down because I was just like, I don't know what to do now. Like, I'm overwhelmed with everything that I've been doing. I've been doing this for years. How can I now stop? Because it's not just saying I stopped watching porn. There's also the thoughts that now occur. It's having to realize, how do I now live this new life? And so in the midst of that, I was just recognizing the biggest thing I had to do was to actually go for counseling. So I spoke with someone, and the person had mentioned, to write down every person that has pained you. And I was just like, what? Like, why would I write down every person that pained me? Like, I would not do that. But it took me a while. But the directions was, to make a list, write down the person's name, write down that pain, write down the lies you believed from that pain, and then write down a prayer to go against that lie, and then also a Bible verse against that. So I had 10 different situations that occurred over life. And then I realized that there were 2 things that were in common in the midst of all these 10 pains. It was that I believed that I was ugly. And then the second one was my abandonment issues, like feeling neglected. And so that's where it really showed me that the reason why I'm doing all these things is based off of something from a childhood, and even from the lies. Like, it just so happened to be that in regards to me feeling like I was ugly, it just so happened to be that my dad, even though, he's not necessarily big in Christianity per se, he loves the story of Job. And so he picked my name from the book of Job. After Job had lost everything, Job was now restored. He had new children. And of the children, one of the daughter's names was Kezia. And so it just so happened to be that with that verse with Job 42:14 and 15, it mentions that Kezia, was one of the fairest daughters of all the land. So it was one of those things where I was like, oh Lord, thank you. I'm beautiful in your sight. It was just an affirmation from God. I don't have to wait on anyone to tell me anything, but just recognizing how much God views me. And so that's where I had to realize I had to let God's thoughts define me. Just to not, be so consumed with all the things I've gone through, which were factual, which occurred, but just to recognize that, this is not too hard for God, that he's able to heal me. But it took time and intentionality and really surrendering and just being honest with God and letting him know, like, this is how I feel. But he's just also letting me know, but this is what I think of you and this is who you are. But it took time. It took time.
Wow.
So I got to play catch up here because you brought up, so many points. But to answer your question about, someone can be beautiful. People can look at them and say that they're beautiful, but they themselves may not feel that. I think that is one of the major roles of the father in the household to affirm the daughter.
For sure.
Could you just unpack that for a minute? Because
Me? No,
because this is so powerful. I'm glad you brought it to that because we have more single parents now raising children than we do dual parents, and the father in media, the father in the home has been so minimized and marginalized. There's a really stupid joke at a men's conference, and it said this kid comes home and he brags to his mom. He says, "Mom, I got a part in the play," and she goes, "Really? What is it?" And he goes, "Well, I play the father," and she goes, "You go back to that school and you tell them you want a speaking part." I mean, and the whole point about that is how we have lost that aspect of the home that we need fathers that do that, and I say this thing about how every girl needs a father that will bounce her on her knee and tell her that she's a princess and that she's precious and that he'll protect her. And how sad that, very few now families have that father image in the home. And even if he's there, many times he's absent. And imagine the burden that puts on the single mothers in the churches that have children that are desperate for a masculine image and affirmation to say that you are precious and that and beautiful to them. So I think there's so much more to be shared about that and how like the enemy to destroy the father in the home. So that people grow up like what you've been exposed to and thinking that your only validation is in whether people find you sexually desirable or not.
You also brought up Job. Oh, Job's story is just, there's so much in there for each of us. But talking about how we can come to God with anything, our dirtiest, our greatest, whatever the case. I mean, Job, if you remember his conversation with God, he's like, why this, why that? There's so much chaos in the world, just like letting loose. And he was able to have that conversation with God, and yet he's still called a perfect man. God was there to listen to him and have that conversation. I don't think we should ever be afraid. And if we are, I think it's because we need to address the lies that we've been telling ourselves and that we've been told.
Address the lies.
For sure.
And the next thing, as I said, I don't need to catch up, but you were asking about parents and how they can talk to their kids. Another thing that came up in my mind, I mean, you guys brought up so many amazing points, which are so true, but also for parents to lead the conversation through asking questions to their kids. So to see where their head is at, or to see how they respond to certain things. The story that you shared about the mom and her daughter wanting to see a naked man. I mean, she was in control of that whole conversation and asking questions. I would come in my home, I always felt open to come to my mom about everything. Problem was, as a child, I didn't always know what to ask, or just some certain things were just not in my mind to be able to ask. And then I would get into a situation and just like, oh man, I would come to my mom. She was like, oh yeah, this is what you do. And I was like, man, like, why didn't you tell me before? And her response is, oh, because you didn't ask. And I'm like, Mom, like, how am I supposed to know to ask this? And I get on her about that all the time, but we're fine. But I think that's super important for the parent to ask a question, not just wait for the kid to come and ask them.
Yeah. But the reaction of the parent, I think, as well. Like, if we freak out and negatively react, you know what I mean?
It's a message.
I guarantee you that kid's going to be like, oh, this is what happens if I mention this. You know what I mean? So, if something at school happens or whatever. Like I can remember my brother-in-law coming and sharing with my wife something that happened to his child at daycare, and his child was, I think, 5 or something like this at the time, and his child came and said, "Oh, one of the other boys did this and this and this to me." You know what I mean? As a parent, it's like hard not to be like, "What?" And you want to just roll over to the daycare and be like, "We're gonna regulate this whole place,"
Regulate.
Yeah, that was a '90s term.
Somehow I missed it.
Yeah. but I think we need to be able to react in a loving, calm manner, and to me, I keep going back to that's how God reacted with me.
Can I jump in, because you know something? That little kid that was exposed to that stuff in that daycare, you can't stop that. That's going to happen no matter where you are in your Christian experience, no matter how hard you try to protect your children. But your reaction to it can change the whole event. Like to be, like if you would have had the ability to go to your mother and say, "This is what happened in daycare," your mother could have helped you process and said, "It was unfortunate that happened. This isn't what God wants for you. Those are your private places, and nobody should ever touch you because you are a princess and you're royalty." And, then the kid is able to kind of move from that and just say, "Okay, this is an acceptable behavior. This happened. It's in my past, but it doesn't have to form my future."
Yeah.
Amen.
And because you didn't have that, look at how it ended up doing this snowball effect in your life.
And also, like to even bring it further when you're a teenager too, if your child, let's say you catch your child watching pornography, if it's like freak out mode, super embarrassment, shut everything down and tell everybody, like my kid has a problem, you may cause that child to go more darker into the closet, where it's like, they're just going to be more careful down the road. Rather than that approach, sitting down and saying, "This is not God's design. This is the reason for this," and to lovingly say, "I'm here for you," and there's an issue.
There's always a difference when you're told to do something versus when you decide to do something.
Wow.
So when a parent just overreacts and it's like, "Oh, you've told me not to do this," or "You've created a rule. There's this desire. Okay, I'm going to break it now. I'm going to keep it from you." But if you explain it and then the child understands, it's like, "Okay, I'm deciding not to do this again." It's more lasting.
Yeah. Because it's theirs.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow, this is good stuff, guys.
could go
this
on
should be
for
like a
an
3 or 4 hour show.
Wait, there's more. She's got more. I want you to tell them about that Sunday that you came to my sister's house, because she was blocking.
I'll tell you what. Let's save it for the post show.
Okay.
So
What's the post show, Scotty? Tell them
the
about the
post show for those that help support our ministry, because we put out a lot of content for free. So people that support our ministry and really help us out on a month-to-month basis, we like to give you something extra, something that you just can't get. So we do that through Patreon. If you want to hear more of Kezia's story and some of the other little details, jump over to Patreon, and there's a lot of really cool perks there. But that's kind of our way, just saying thank you to the people that help keep the lights on and the cameras rolling on our place here. So, any last thoughts before we kind of close down, you guys? I know we've been throwing thoughts all over, but
I do want to mention that your testimony is like, we kind of talked about this already, but like your testimony just shows that God is not trying to keep something fun away, like, "Oh, Christians, you can't have sex or watch porn or whatever." It's like, it just shows that God's design is perfect. He designed it this way. It's only become what it is because of all the perversion and all the twisting. But when you enter into these situations, sex before marriage, you bring in kids in the world that aren't even wanted, and then you have fathers that distance themselves, and they create a being who grows up without a father and trying to fill these voids with all these promiscuous lifestyles and drugs and everything. So just to maybe address, like, for people who think, "Man, why can't I do this? Why is God keeping all this fun stuff from me?" It just shows, it's a testimony to His perfect design.
I think the devil is a master at making hurtful things look fun.
Yeah.
Things that are like enticing, like, he could make eating trash be something beautiful. And the opposite is so true. If we adhere to God's principles, there's true fulfillment in that. There's true love that God wants. And the devil's like, "No, lust is love." You know what I mean? The idea of taking something from someone else, and that's the idea, but that's just a total lie. It's really like, if you adhere by what God is saying in a marriage context, that's when sex should be the most enjoyed and everything. that's going to give you fulfillment in your life. And that's what we see actually in the studies. There's study after study after study that say if you have only one partner, those are the most fulfilled sexual relationships. And you know, the more partners you go down the road, you can see the graph. It goes down. The more variety of things that the world quote unquote is like, this is fun, orgies are fun, whatever, all these things is what you should engage in. Look at how you walk away from that empty, hurt, and even deeper into it.
I'd like to encourage parents, and I'm not a parent, but listening to you guys, you know, the pressure is on. It seems like
good. Good. It's good pressure.
It's good pressure.
Yeah, necessary.
But I'm sure it's easy to get overwhelmed and things like that. But just to remember, you know, who is in control and who you can always go to, and in praying for not only your children, but for praying for the Holy Spirit to give you the words to say, to have your kids ask the right questions. I mean, that's what the Holy Spirit, that's His work, to impress upon the heart and the mind. So we just want to encourage each and every one of you, and know that we're praying for you on this show, in our personal lives. We're always praying for the outpouring of the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Well, thank you guys for watching. What a blessing to have you guys on our show. Thank you for coming. As always, if you are new to our channel, we love to handle topics like this that, you know, just needs to shed some light on the darkness that we all have gotten ourselves into. And, you know, like our video, subscribe. If you know other people that are struggling with a topic like this, feel free to share this video with other people. Post it on Facebook. Share our videos. They're meant to be shared. And we just want to thank you, Patreon donors, for helping donate to this ministry so that we can keep doing these kind of projects. And we always want to hear from you. So leave a comment, leave a thumbs up, and God bless you guys. We'll see you next Friday.
Bye.